Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And so we're back. This is actually our first show since March. We've been off for some months now. First reason for the hiatus, of course, was COVID-19. You know, COVID-19, the hoax that has now killed nearly 200,000 Americans, a figure which I expect will be exceeded by the time you see this, along with an additional 730,000 in the rest of the world. So, COVID-19 hits, the studio was closed, no studio, no show. We talked about trying to do it from my home, but that proved impractical. In fact, even now, we are really being careful. I'm essentially alone in the studio. The camera operator comes in to set it up, to start it, and then just comes back at the break in the end. And other than that, I'm pretty much by myself. But things are operating. The studio is open. We're getting things done. So we hope to be back here at the Erickson Report to our regular 2-week schedule. We could have come back sooner, but something in my personal life happened in May, and I won't bore you with the details, but it did set back our resumption. And then, I'm sure you know the phrase that good things come in threes. It turns out that bad things can too. I was actually in the midst of preparing a show. You know how we're always told to back up our stuff? Here's my advice to you. Back up your backup. I had a computer disaster that cost me essentially all of my critical files, including the backups. I have to tell you that at that point, I was actually tempted to just throw the whole thing over. I just wasn't sure if I was up to starting from scratch. But after a few days of licking my wounds, I decided, what the heck, let's give it a go. So here we are, coming off certainly an eventful spring and summer, and I'm not referring to mine, but to ours as a whole, as a people as a whole. I'm not even going to try to recap those past months. Rather, I'm just going to have some observations about some things. For one thing, these months brought the issue of race back into the national consciousness. Protests for days, for weeks, for months, maintained by the repeated blows of new stories, with a new heartbreak coming whenever the pain from the previous heartbreak was maybe just starting to fade a little bit. We don't even have the time to say her name or say his name, because there's always a new name. On March 20th, it was Breonna Taylor in Louisville, killed in a hail of gunfire that left dozens of shell casings scattered across that apartment and multiple holes in various places in the wall, showing that the cops essentially just fired wildly at anything in front of them. On April 24th, it was Nicholas Chavez in Houston, shot down in the midst of a mental health episode. On May 25th, it was George Floyd in Minneapolis, slowly suffocated over the course of 8 minutes, although it seemed like 8 months at times, suffocated over the course of 8 minutes with a cop's knee in his neck. On August 23rd, it was Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, shot in the back in front of his kids. On September 2nd, it was Daniel Prude in Rochester, New York, being made to lie naked on a wet street without even a blanket, a hood over his head, and knees in his back. This after happening and experiencing a mental health crisis, which the cops were told about when the call was made. Of those people, only Jacob Blake survived. And finally, here I've got for you one incident. No one was hurt in this one, but it shows what's wrong with policing in the U.S. and what's wrong with our society as a whole. September 5th, Tempe, Arizona, a cop responds to a report of a trespasser at a hotel. The manager tells the cop that the guy has a gun and describes him as a white guy, black shirt, tan pants. The cop goes around to a side door, sees a hotel employee coming out, a black guy in a light gray shirt and black pants, and the cop holds the guy at gunpoint for over 2 minutes, claiming he matches the description of the gunman. Okay, white guy, black shirt, tan pants, black guy, light gray shirt, black pants. Cop looks at the black guy and says, "That looks like the guy." The question, and I think the answer is obvious, is why? Why do cops, no less than the rest of society, but then again, they have the guns. Why do cops see a black man and think criminal, suspect, dangerous? You know the answer as well as I do. The response to all this has been an ongoing wave of street protest over police violence and brutality, most particularly over police shootings of unarmed black men. Yes, in those demonstrations there has been some destruction, some rioting, but frankly, we shouldn't have been surprised any more than we should have been surprised by the media's abject and repeated failure to put that rioting in context, to even refer to the anger and the frustration that they knew they had to know was there, preferring instead to repeatedly focus on any violence, to equate protests with violence, while grudgingly referring to the 99% of nonviolent protests as mostly or generally peaceful, before getting to what they really wanted to show, not because it's the most important or the most meaningful or the most expressive of actual events, but because it's the most dramatic. It makes for the best visuals. For them, it's the most fun. We should not have been surprised. In the wake of the 1992 Los Angeles riots, sparked by the acquittal of the cops who brutally beat Rodney King, I wrote that we knew the anger was there. We knew the desperation was there. We knew the rage was there. The only question was what would be the proximate cause of their expression. The same is true here and now. Then the spark was Rodney King. This time it was Breonna Taylor who lit the fuse and George Floyd who set off the blast. We shouldn't have been surprised that among all the marches and the protests, there was some destruction, some rioting. In fact, we should have been surprised that there wasn't more. Because we've known all along. We've known about the bigotry and the frustration all along. We knew it 2 years ago, when the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights issued a report called Police Use of Force, which concluded that, and I'm quoting here, the best available evidence reflects high rate of the use of force nationally and increased likelihood of police use of force against people of color, people with disabilities, LGBT people, people with mental health concerns, people with low incomes, and those at the intersections of those groups. We knew it 52 years ago. The Kerner Commission, set up by Lyndon Johnson to consider the causes of the so-called long, hot summer of 1967, when there were riots in 159 cities, found that the causes were poverty and institutional racism. What's more, quoting the report now, white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. The white institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. The nation, the commission warned, was poised to fracture into two very unequal societies, one black and one white. We knew it over 70 years ago, when a commission appointed by Harry Truman declared that, quoting again, there is evidence of lawless police action against whites and Negroes alike, but the dominant pattern is that of race prejudice. Negroes have been shot, supposedly in self-defense, under circumstances indicating at best unsatisfactory police work in the handling of criminals, at worst a callous willingness to kill. We knew it almost 100 years ago. In 1922, in the aftermath of a so-called race riot in Chicago 3 years earlier, a commission on race relations found that the Negro problem, as it was then called, was not the making of black men and women. Quoting, no group in our population is less responsible for its existence. We have known all along, and here I specifically mean white society. We have known, and we did our best to ignore it. Over the years, over the decades, over the century, we did our best to ignore it, to say it was their fault, it's their failing, only roused to some palliatives when that boiling anger broke free to a degree we could not ignore. That is until things calmed down a bit, when we went right back to ignoring it. Face facts, white people. It's our fault. We are responsible. We are to blame. And we are doubly to blame because we're the ones with the economic and political power to do something about it, and yet we continually fail to do so, even as we go around bragging about how generous we are. One last thing on this for now. Don't even bother telling me that the destruction, what there was of it, the destruction was caused by the rioters, unless you were then prepared to seriously address the question of what caused the rioters. All right, moving on to another issue raised by the summer, one equally happy. I must tell you this bluntly, our democracy is at risk. It is at risk of becoming, at least at the national level, risk of becoming just a shell, a facade of demonstration elections with the outcomes predetermined to benefit those who need no benefits, becoming a game we play, a story we tell ourselves. Now understand, I do not say this lightly, but what we need to realize is that we do not have to become an overt right-wing police state in order to make our elections meaningless. It isn't necessary for the right wing to control everything about our elections. It's only necessary for them to control enough electoral votes to keep the presidency in their control, enough precincts in enough states to keep the Senate in their control, enough state legislatures to control redistricting to keep, or at the moment regain, the House and keep that in their control. The weapon being used is voter suppression. Because in each case, at each level, the key for them is not winning enough votes, but controlling who can vote. Striving to ensure that only those people the most likely to vote the way they want can vote, and those most likely to vote a different way won't be able to. Which means, ultimately, keeping minorities, students, and the poor away from the ballot box. This actually is not new, not by any means. In a recent book, One Person, One Vote, Professor Carol Anderson, chair of African American Studies at Emory University, described how ever since the 15th Amendment, which banned preventing people from voting on the account of race, racists, especially but not exclusively in the South, have been trying to find ways to exclude blacks from voting while being able to claim that it had nothing to do with race. And every time one method was struck down, they came up with another one. In fact, some of those methods persisted into the 1960s. Literacy tests were around until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Poll taxes persisted until the adoption of the 24th Amendment in 1964 and a Supreme Court decision in 1966. It's nothing new. Only the methods have changed. Now it's ID laws that just by chance affect far more blacks than whites and far more of the poor than those wealthier. It's voter purges that, just by chance, of course, wind up kicking far more blacks than whites off the voting rolls. It's provisional ballots to make people who actually haven't voted think that they have. And this year, something new has been added. With the prospect of a massive increase in mail ballots, we have administrative reforms in the U.S. Postal Service, which, just by coincidence, of course, threaten to significantly slow down the delivery of mail-in ballots, which, just by coincidence, of course, are more heavily used by Democratic voters than GOPR ones. Now, I guarantee you I'll have more to say about this the next time. But for now, what I want to say is, if you intend to vote by mail, do it as soon as possible. If possible, do it now. And this. I normally tell people in a presidential election that if you live in a safe state, one that will most certainly go either blue or red, vote for a third party. But this year, and I feel really, really creepy saying this year I'm telling you to vote for Joe Biden. Because I want Tweety Pie to not only lose the electoral vote, I want him to lose the popular vote by such a margin that even he would not be able to claim that the voting was rigged. Because I truly fear that if he can make that claim, he will. And I fear even more what could come of that. And we're going to take a break. And we are back. Now there are at least two other things I wanted to get to this time, but I'm going to put them off until next time now so I can take the rest of the show for our regular and perhaps our most popular segment, which is called 2 Weeks of Stupid, Clowns and Outrages. Going first, as we usually do with the clowns, we note that mifeprex, which is also known as RU-486, is a widely used medication to induce a medical abortion. It's even included on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. However, blockhead right-winger Ted Cruz is pushing to have the FDA declare it dangerous. His reasoning? Pregnancy, I'm quoting him here, pregnancy is not a life-threatening illness, and the abortion pill does not cure or prevent any disease. What? Now, it's true, you can't really call pregnancy an illness, obviously, but it most certainly can be life-threatening. The CDC says, quoting them, about 700 women die each year in the United States as a result of pregnancy or delivery complications. And they say also that something like 50,000 more experience serious complications, some of those with long-term consequences. Meanwhile, the WHO reports that around the world, nearly 300,000 women die every year as a result of pregnancy complications. Oh, and by the way, you know what is deadlier than RU-486? What is associated with orders of magnitude more deaths than RU-486, but seems of no concern to Ted Cruz? Viagra. All right, now what with Cruz only having the support of 20 Senate goppers, not even half his caucus, it seems unlikely that this will go anywhere, at least for now. But what this does prove, yet again, is that Republican men talking about reproductive issues are both hopelessly ignorant and thoroughgoing clowns. All right, next up, on September 10th, the NFL opened its season with the Houston Texans playing the Kansas City Chiefs in Kansas City. Before the opening kickoff, players on both teams joined together, linking arms in what was called a moment of unity in support of racial equality. A nice symbolic of quite anodyne, quite inoffensive moment. At least you think it would be inoffensive. But what could you clearly hear from the stands during that moment? Booing. That's right, although in fairness, I have to say it was not most of the fans. A significant number of those in the stands were booing the idea of racial equality. Color me unsurprised, color them clowns. Finally, here we offer proof that having liberal, even progressive credentials is no protection against being a doofus. Frederick Joseph, a former national surrogate for Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, and regarded as a respected commentator on race in America, recently rented an Airbnb in the Catskills, but then claimed on Twitter that he and his family had to flee the house because they were, his word, terrified by what they claimed was evidence of satanic items and stuff for witchcraft rituals. He was particularly incensed, we know because he put this part in all caps, at finding a Baphomet statue. Now, Baphomet is a deity that the Knights Templar were accused of worshiping in the early 1300s, and in the years since has been incorporated into various occult traditions. The small statue in question, it's actually only a couple of inches tall, is actually a so-called sabbatic goat. The image is intended to represent what its 1856 creator called the equilibrium of opposites. The idea is that the figure is half human and half animal, half male, half female, good and evil, on and off, and so on and so on. In the years since its creation, the image has become associated with the name Baphomet. Now, other terrifying items included, among others, a really tacky plastic toy of a woman having sex with a dog, 2 small framed photos, a man and a woman, both topless, a taxidermy pheasant in a plastic bag, and some candles. In other words, a bunch of kitsch. But no, wait. Joseph said that there were satanic markings on the floor of the basement. Except that when Vice.com was able to go on a video tour of the house with the owner, those satanic markings look a lot more like just paint smudges. But what really sealed Joseph's status as a clown for me, he apparently was also set off by, quoting, a bridge from the woods behind the house to the back patio. Now, why that would be threatening anyway, I don't quite understand, but this is the so-called bridge. It's a board someone threw over a stream, and it's not even connected to the patio. Frederick Joseph, a progressive and a clown. All right, moving on to the outrages. On September 3rd, the Tweety Pie administration proposed rule changes to the Endangered Species Act. Changes that Noah Greenwald, director of the Endangered Species Program at the Center for Biological Diversity, called a disaster for endangered species and the natural world. Now, one of the purposes of the Endangered Species Act is to protect such species by labeling certain areas critical habitat, areas necessary for the species' well-being and continued survival. The proposed changes would require the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to assign weight to industry claims of an economic impact in a given area if it's to be declared critical habitat, and to, on that basis, exclude federal lands essential to the recovery of species, exclude them from the protection of the Act. Now, make that clear. Currently, areas may be excluded from the protection of the Act if that exclusion would have no impact on the survival of the species. The changes, as I understand them, would allow for such exclusion even if there is such an impact, thus raising the economic interests of the polluters and despoilers over the preservation of nature. Even worse, according to Greenwald, the polluters and despoilers would not even have to prove the economic claims that they are making. It's just another of the 1,000 cuts, the 1,000 outrages the Tweety Pie gang has inflicted on protection of the environment and those who live in it, yes, including people, just to make sure their fat cat pals can afford to put another unnecessary addition on their mansions. Now, as a footnote to that, I will just mention that there is a movement developing called Rights of Nature that looks to obtain for ecosystem legal status in our court system as rights-bearing entities. The idea is not, as sarcasm would have it, to give every tree a lawyer, but rather that an ecosystem would be regarded in court as a party with legal interests. The big asset here is that this would enable organizations and even individuals to sue polluters on behalf of the ecosystem without having to prove that they themselves were personally damaged by the harm they're causing. And where, if such suits are successful, the damages involved would be to the ecosystem as a whole rather than just the individual, and so the remedial actions would also have to be for the ecosystem, not just for the individual. Toledo actually tried this in 2019 about Lake Erie, but lost in trial court this spring, and the city felt it didn't have the economic resources to pursue the matter further. Now, suing on behalf of a third party is hardly new. In fact, suing on behalf of some defined non-living entity is not new. So rights of nature, at the very least, isn't outside the reach of legal theory. But yes, it is radical, and as a result, it is worthy of our respect and our attention. All right, next up is the outrage that never seems to end. It's like an asymptote, which, if you don't know, is a curve on a graph that keeps approaching zero but never actually gets there. The value keeps getting smaller and smaller but never actually disappears. I am talking here about the death penalty. Even as public support continues to decline, even as fewer states even have the death penalty on their books, and most of those that have it use it less and less, still it persists like some noxious weed. On August 28th, Keith Dwayne Nelson became the 5th person the Trump administration has legally murdered this summer. Before this summer, the federal government had not had an execution in 17 years. Since July, there have now been 5, with 2 more scheduled for late September and more dates to be rumored on the way. Even without those, our killer-in-chief has already carried out more federal executions since July than his predecessors had in the previous 57 years combined. The death penalty is notoriously ineffective at controlling crime, notoriously racist in its operation, not only in who is sentenced to death, but who is convicted of the crime. I started to say that the death penalty is a lingering remnant of a barbarous age, but then I realized that we're not really that far from that barbarity, are we? In any event, the death penalty remains what it always has been, an outrage. Finally, for this time out, on August 11th, racist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic QAnon devotee Marjorie Taylor Greene, the picture being as appropriately fuzzy as her thought processes, won a GOPR primary for Georgia's 14th district. She won with the backing of GOP mega-donors, along with such as the chair of the board of the Heritage Foundation and groups associated to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. Her win makes her the odds-on favorite to get the seat come November in this heavily goppered district. That is despite the fact that she is, again, a racist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic QAnon devotee. Perhaps to celebrate her victory, on her Facebook page, recently posted an image of herself holding a gun alongside images of Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar, and wrote that we need strong conservatives to go on the offense against these socialists. That transparent incitement to murder was too much even for Facebook, which took it down. The outrage here is not so much at her victory and her violence-promoting fear-mongering, but how much the amorphous blob that is QAnon has penetrated the body of the Gopper Party and how eager, remember, mega donors are to embrace it. But an even deeper point is that while almost any right-wing fever dream can be made to fit under the heading of QAnon, there is a core that reveals something older and more familiar. Consider what QAnon claims, notes Gregory Stanton, an expert on genocide, writing at justsecurity.org on September 9th. A secret cabal is taking over the world. They kidnap children, slaughter and eat them to gain power from their blood. They control high positions in government, finance, and the news media. They want to disarm the police. They promote homosexuality and pedophilia. They want to let in foreigners to mongrelize the white race. Except, wait, yes, that is what QAnon claims, among other fantasies. But it's also the plot, if you can call it that, of the notorious anti-Semitic pamphlet, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a work fabricated around 1902 by simply piling together whatever anti-Jewish tropes were lying around. The Nazis had their hero, which was Adolf Hitler, who was going to rescue them from this plot. QAnon fanatics have their Tweety Pie. In short, and yes, despite some differences in the details of the fantasies, QAnon is nothing more than a rebranding of the most notorious anti-Semitic work in history, right down to Hitler's stormtroopers that helped him come to power, and QAnon's awaiting of the storm, the day when supporters of the cabal will be rounded up and executed. And it could well lead to the same bloody result. Stanton's insight, drawn from his experience studying genocide and conditions leading up to it, brought to mind the old saying that nothing is as obvious as the truth once somebody has said it. The targets may have expanded beyond Jews to include socialist immigrants and any other opponents of the dream of a lily-white society that never actually existed, but the meaning is the same and the threat is real. Outrage hardly expresses it. That's it. We're done for this. We will see you in 2 weeks. In the meantime, as always, you have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. Stay safe and peace.
That's what happened.